In this video, I'm going to explain a little bit about the articles that you have to use on your assignments. And just to give you some idea of what's involved in this, what you're trying to do is interpret the data that they have available. So for example, if we look down here on page 3 of 5, it mentions things that the students were doing in terms of how much time they spent on that. So this shows us that we have a mean with a standard deviation. This plus or minus generally means that that's a standard deviation. So if somebody asks us, well, what was the mean for this? They spent 2.5 hours watching TV. If the next question we asked was, well, how much time did the middle 68% of the people spend watching TV, you'd add one standard deviation and subtract one standard deviation. One of the interesting things about that, though, is one standard deviation below the mean is going to leave us 0.2 hours. So this is a situation where the data is not normally distributed. It doesn't really make sense to provide a standard deviation. There's something that is causing the mean to be pulled up and give us this false standard deviation. But in general, that's what it's asking about. Another thing about this particular article that I'm asking a question about is how they were asked to rate the food choices. And you'll notice here that they have a 10-point scale. And what I'm asking about in the discussion on the assignment questions is whether or not these are appropriate. If you remember back, we talked a little bit in class about whether or not it is appropriate to use means on every single kind of numerical data. There's some numerical data, ordinal data in particular, that's inappropriate to take means on it. So that's what that is getting at. I think for the most part, from this article and probably the one about patterns of weight loss, you ought to be able to get what it is that they're talking about. One of the other articles asks a question about patterns of weight loss and supplement consumption in male wrestlers. Let's pause. Hang on. On that question, what it's asking you about is, if you remember the part of the class where we talked about the difference between those in a book club and those not in a book club, that it is really important that you have some kind of statistical analysis, because sometimes just looking at numbers doesn't really give you a picture, doesn't really tell the story about what we want to know. And that's what that question in your assignment is asking about, is just really tell the story and why or why not. On the correlations, there's one called alcohol policy enforcement. In general, what we're getting at on these assignments is whether or not, first of all, whether or not you can interpret a correlation table. I'm going to pause for just a second and scroll this down. On this one, there's a couple of things that you need to pay attention to. The first one has to do with how they collected the data. We said that there's specific types of correlations that are used depending on what type of data is collected. If it's ordinal data, that takes a specific type of correlation. If it's interval ratio data, actually real numbers, that is a different type of correlation. So you need to look at that and what kind of evidence they gathered using to use this correlation coefficient. The other thing it's asking about simply is, what are the significant correlations? You find significant correlations generally by an asterisk like this. So we may ask on this one as an example, it's going to be easy for you, what is the significant correlation here? Well, this is the only one. And it has to do with this point. There's deans, campus security chiefs, and students. Policy enforcement report versus one of these 4 variables. So you have to be able to figure out which of those variables are important. The other one has to do with text messaging. And again, this is pretty straightforward in terms of how we look at the tables. We're going to scroll down, attempt to scroll down. Now, the way that this correlation table is set up is we have these 5 variables: ratio of textism to words, number of translation errors, verbal SAS scores, nonverbal SAS scores, number of texts sent per day, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. These are the same variables, 2, 3, 4, 5. So this number 2, number of translation errors, is the same as this number 2. We don't see a number 1 here because, as we said in the class, the correlation between ratio of textism to words and ratio of textism to words is 1. It doesn't make any sense. So we could ask a question about what is the smallest correlation. And if we look at this table, what we're looking for is the one closest to 0. So that would be the correlation between number 2 and number 3. Or another way to say that is number of translation errors and verbal SAS scores. When you write about correlations, you always want to put both parts of those, so it's very clear what you're talking about. The other one, which is a little further down in study 2, here's the other correlation table. Again, it's the same thing. There's 5 variables that are being studied. These 5 variables are the same as these up here. This number 2, age when received phone, is this number 2. The difference here now is we have 2 different levels of significance. Some of them were significant at the 0.05 level, some are in the 0.01 level. And you can tell by how many asterisks are pointed to those. So this one's at the 0.01 level, this one's at the 0.05 level. Beyond that, it's just simply interpreting the correlation coefficients. So I hope that helps. If you have questions, be sure to email me. Thank you.